Maryland or at MIT or at Harvard, now you're in control, because they're going to have to talk to you, the people over at the B school or the Sloan school, as to what you're going to have to now talk about in terms of improving the technology, right? Right now, they just straight arm them. They're out of the room. We're not listening to you, We don't have to improve anything, okay? So that's really what we're talking about, right? How do we create a formula that accomplishes that goal? So, my goal here is just to find a way of holding them to what they're saying right now they're going to do like an allowance, okay? There's got to be some penalty. There's got to be something you're going to take away. You're grounded, If you don't perform on the allowance, okay, you're grounded for 2 weeks, and then you have to make it stick, right? So we need to find a way of doing that. When we move forward, we just have to accomplish that goal. I'm just going to ask one more quick question right now, and that is that Dr. Morisi, you proposed that when we provide the assistance to the companies, that they perform the R&D and their first large production runs in the United States. The condition would be that beneficiaries share their patents at reasonable cost with other companies who will be here in the United States making vehicles. You suggest that this could attract producers from around the world and rejuvenate the U.S. auto supply chain. Do you think that people would continue to develop these new technologies if the large profit margin disappeared? And I'd like you to just answer that question so that we don't kind of create something that actually doesn't attract anyone to that fund.
That the reasonable has to be reasonable. If you come up with a great idea and it's worth something, the other car companies can have access to it, but they have to pay for it as well. So that worked in Japan. It worked just fine. That's what they did in the 70s and 80s with their technology program. If we require that Americans drive vehicles with high mileage standards, and we provide R&D incentives to develop the products here, I don't think we're going to have much trouble getting. The reason I want to do that is I want to get Toyota, Nissan, and Honda involved because we want access to their technology. We want to encourage them to locate more of what they do here.
Okay, and one of the suggestions on the panel was that these factories that General Motors and Ford and Chrysler have right now that they might not be using in the future might be made available. I think I heard someone say that to people like Mr. Munger and others, okay? So that it just doesn't get shut down, but we move it over to the new companies moving in. Was that you, Mr. Wardle? Somebody made that proposal.
Yes, I certainly believe.
So talk about that concept in the context of Mr. Munger and Tesla and these other new companies.
There is no doubt that these new companies have already worked out the products that we need, and at the same time, the legacy auto industry certainly has a lot of expertise and capability of turning products into high-volume manufactured vehicles. And so I think it would be a missed opportunity if some way was not found of harnessing those idle capabilities in the legacy industry to the benefit of the startup companies, so long as none of the defensive attitudes, if you like, of the legacy industry would dilute in any way the innovation of the startup companies. So it has to be the right relationship so that the best parts of the current auto industry are made available to the most innovative aspects of entrepreneurial startup companies.
Okay, great. And I'll just give you the quote from the White House press spokesperson Perino today, as opposed to building the kind of the promise of the industry into the law. She said, quote, today, if the viability advisor says that they're not making progress, then that company, the automaker, would have to pay the taxpayer back right away. So there's the incentive for everybody to work hard to make this work. Good enough for you, Ms. Clayburgh?
No.
Good enough for you, Mr. Munger?
It's not obvious how you repay a loan when it's a loan you require.
Dr. Morisi, good enough for you?
No, it's not good enough for me. I want more than that.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Waddle, good enough for you?
No.
No?
No.
Thank you. Mr. Curls was shaking his head vigorously sideways, so you know what his answer was. Let me turn now and recognize the gentlelady from Michigan, Ms. Miller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I appreciate all of the witnesses and some of the testimony that's been given here. And to my colleague, Mr. Cleaver from Missouri, the Detroit Lions are having a rather tough season this year along with the domestic auto industry, but hey, how about those Red Wings? You know, there's been some talk about the CAFE standards. I think uniformity is key. It was interesting for us to note. I realize we sound a little defensive here again. Interesting to note that Nissan got a loophole in the CAFE standards last time. I'm not quite sure how all of that worked out, but I do think uniformity is a key. And I appreciate, and we're going to see how all of this is going to work when you have various states coming up with their own emission standards. And as part of the law, it will preclude the auto industry from any litigation trying to stop that. I do wonder sometimes, I mean, for instance, if you took maybe an industry from California, from Hollywood, I mean, if you were a movie maker and every single state in the union could have their own determination of what the rating was on a movie, how would you market that movie? PG in some states and R's in others and these kinds of things. So I do think uniformity is the key, but I recognize that there is a bit of a double standard here. But my question would be, and I appreciated some of the comments Mr. Wardle was making about in Britain and the experience that you had there when some of the transplants, as we call them here, came into your country. But it seems to me that our nation has not, and our Congress has not done as good a job as we should have of having a manufacturing policy, really, or a comprehensive, cohesive industrial policy. For instance, in Britain now we see Ford manufacturing their diesel engine, which is apparently can get 65 miles per gallon there, but yet there was a concerted effort to incent people, de-incent them to purchase gasoline and to incent them to purchase diesel as part of sort of the country's policy and through the EU as well. I'm just not quite sure who I'm asking this question of, but it does seem to me that if our nation had a more comprehensive industrial policy and a manufacturing policy, we could advantage ourselves in many ways because of this crisis that we're finding ourselves faced with now, right. As we're busy putting all of these laws and oversight and et cetera. I think we all want the same thing at the end, and maybe we could look at it in a little broader vision of how we can help our country go forward with such a policy.
Mrs. Miller, we have a manufacturing policy in the United States. We have an anti-industrial policy. It's that simple. Whether we have a Democratic administration or a Republican administration, we get the same Treasury Secretary. We get Bob Rubin in one form or another. And the guys from Wharton on up through the Charles River don't know much about factories, aren't much interested in them, and don't really care very much. Okay? And as a consequence, I've watched this body, I've urged, I've written op-ed articles, I've sent you press releases over and over again about our toleration of the Chinese currency policy and how it is devastating your part of the country. And, you know, nothing ever happens. The inability to move on trade policy has done more damage to the manufacturing base in the United States can be possibly managed by one man or woman, but we've tolerated it. When Wall Street gets in trouble, you guys passed a $700 billion bailout, which gave them essentially all the money they wanted and then some, and whatever you don't give them, the Federal Reserve gives them with virtually no strings. They haven't done any of the responsible things to speak of necessary to reopen credit markets, such as reopening the securitization pipeline from good, sound regional banks to fixed income investors. And that goes on and on and on. So we have a policy. My son, somebody said to me, people don't want to study engineering in this country. They're too lazy. They are not too lazy. There's a reason the finance department is full. The same math that is in an engineering textbook or a physics textbook is in a finance textbook. I know. I studied it. But we have lots of kids who want to study finance because that's where the rewards are in our society, and to a large measure, that's a product of public policy. Engineering doesn't pay out because manufacturing doesn't pay out. Manufacturing doesn't pay out because we have a dumb trade policy.
Mr. Wardle.
Yes, I see a lot of parallels, as I mentioned before, between what happened in the UK and what is happening in Detroit now, largely because of inept management in the British car industry that refused to acknowledge that overseas companies were developing products that UK consumers actually needed. But one of the mistakes I think that was made in Britain, which hopefully can be avoided in the US, was that the government intervention in the British car industry was of the wrong kind. What we really need here is clear direction and policy from government, which I believe is something that is always needed, which industry can respond to, and which is why I think that first of all we need this. We need to set up what I would say is a mobility czar to look at this situation rather than an auto czar, so that it's quite clear what kind of transportation future that we have. So that we know and from that to direct policy so that everybody knows what the hurdles are that they have to jump over or what the parameters are that they have to operate their businesses in. And so it would be wrong to directly intervene with the existing car industry through too much internal messing around, but the parameters need to be very clear through government legislation and policy. But that needs to come from very clear oversight as to what are the right answers. And that's something that was never established in in Britain in the 70s. Nobody actually stated what the clear objectives were for the rebirth of the British car industry, so it didn't happen.
Mrs. Miller, I'd like to associate myself with both of those remarks and say that I do hope that this committee, and Mr. Chairman, this committee will have a hearing on transportation policy, because we actually don't have a transportation policy in this system, in this country, and the President-elect has just announced that he wants to have a huge infrastructure expenditure. Well, if you're going to spend a huge amount more money on infrastructure, you better figure out what infrastructure you want and what really makes a difference. We have bridges and roads that are in disrepair, admittedly, but we don't have mass transit systems that go to the airport, for example. And one of the provisions in this legislation that you're going to be voting on, Section 13, requires the auto manufacturers to study whether or not they should get involved in producing mass transit type vehicles, whether it's rail or whether it's urban transit, and as a way to expand the scope and the view of their manufacturing activities. And I would urge that this committee hold some very soon hearings, because the Infrastructure Committee, one of the problems with the Congress, it's divided up. The Infrastructure Committee, that's the Public Works crowd, is a different committee than the Commerce Committee, which looks at transportation generally. And I would urge both this committee and the Infrastructure Committee to look at transportation policy and what is it that we really want. What makes a difference? People in this country are really frustrated with the changes that have been made by the airline industry because they're in financial trouble. Now you can't get from here to there without going through 3 different cities in an airplane and changing planes. So there's lots of opportunity here for, in this middle of this crisis as well, for looking at overall transportation policy. I would just like to make one last comment, Ms. Miller, about something you said about the states setting standards. The reason that advocates like myself have favored that is because the lobbies have overtaken the Congress and stopped any improvement in fuel economy from 1990, when we lost a bill in a filibuster by 2 votes that would have had by 2001 would have required 40 miles per gallon fuel economy, which would have saved this auto industry.
Thank you.
But if I could just say, the way that you can get around having it be variable is the manufacturers meet the highest standard. So if California sets the highest standard, then there are not a lot of different standards. You meet the California standard. It's one standard.
Just one more question with the chair's indulgence, and I want to pick up on what has been talked about with the trade policies and some of the disadvantages that our manufacturing